Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
We're thrilled to be joined by three excellent think tank colleagues today, Sophia Besch, Varma, and Liana Fix, for a fun summer episode of The Eurofile. We're going to discuss today what impressions they all had coming from Europe to Washington, D.C., working in an American think tank, and anything that comes to mind, really, when it comes to transatlantic differences. So first, I'm going to ask all of you to introduce yourselves, where you came from, where you work now, and when you moved to D.C. Sophia, we'll start with you.
Sure. Hi, Donatien. Hi, Max. It's so nice to be on again and with only friends. This is lovely. So I am a senior fellow in the Year program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. And I moved here in the fall of 2022.
Tara, let's go to you.
Thanks a lot. It's great being here. I am a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and I moved in from Paris in January 2023, so a year and a half ago now.
And then Liana.
Thanks so much for having us. And I moved to Washington, D.C. at the same time as Sophia did in fall 2022. And I went to the Council on Foreign Relations to work as a fellow at the Year program of the Council.
Great. Let's start then maybe with the impressions you all got when you moved to D.C. Pretty interesting times, I would say. 2022, obviously, the beginning of Russia's war in Ukraine. 2023, about a year after that, still a lot of conversations around the transatlantic relationship. What was your first sense of this place? Maybe we'll go the opposite direction and start with you, Liana.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, for every European who is interested in foreign policy or international affairs, it's just so cool to be in Washington, D.C. I mean, because it is the power center, and it doesn't matter if you're in London or Paris or Berlin, it will not just come up to the same vibe of influence. And that is obviously because the United States is still the hegemon in the world. There's nothing else to say. And so every policy decision that the United States takes is relevant for the world, whereas every policy decision that Berlin takes is not necessarily relevant for the world. That is also reflected in a different pace of policy making in Berlin compared to Washington, D.C. There's also, and we'll probably talk about this in more detail, this think tank revolving door culture with government. So there's much closer cooperation with government in general. And specifically at the time when I arrived and also when Sophia arrived in the autumn of 2022, it was still very much focused on Russia's war against Ukraine. So Europeans were actually getting quite a lot of attention, which is nice because in Washington, you often feel that other regions, China, Indo-Pacific, the Middle East, are more important than Europe. And so at that time, there was a lot of interest in European perspectives and also still a lot of thought about how to address the war against Ukraine.
I really agree with what Liana said. I mean, coming to an American think tank, I think, was really important as well, following European politics and trying to understand what the U.S. position is, particularly after the 4 years of the Trump administration where, the Europeans were still pretty traumatized by what had happened and the sense of renewal of the relationship, a form of reset. One of the things that Biden said when he came into office was immediately, America is back. And the fact that there's been so much American involvement also in the support to Ukraine is clearly due to the fact that it was a Democratic and Biden administration, I think. I came into DC with this impression that the relationship had really renewed. But at the same time, we had gone through the AUKUS, I would say, fiasco from a French perspective in the fall of 2021. The IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was also perceived by Europeans as something that I guess they didn't understand really, because again, the message that we had gotten was that America was back and that the transatlantic relationship was back on track as well. And so there was this sense that maybe some of the confidence and the trust that had been built was shattered a little bit. So trying to understand where we were going from there. And I came into DC in January 2023, a couple of months after the midterms election, when I was still in Paris. And I was struck in Paris and traveling inside Europe at the time in the fall of 2022, how widely covered, the midterm elections were in Europe. And of course, echoing what Liana said earlier, there's a massive contrast. European elections are not as widely followed, I would say, in the US as American elections are followed in Europe, though they're maybe a little caveat there. The European parliamentary elections that happened in June 2024 actually were fairly widely covered here. But the contrast of the two was quite striking, and trying to understand where US politics was going is also key to us. I also follow the Indo-Pacific a little bit, and particularly what Europeans want and can do in the Indo-Pacific. And I was really struck that even on discussions on Ukraine, from a US perspective and in US think tank discussions, the discussion always ended on China and what the US and Europe could do on China. So the connection, the interconnection between the two theaters is also something that I found quite striking.
So I would sign off on all of that. I mean, I really sensed this feeling or this need to repair relations with Europeans that I think was dominant in the Biden administration, particularly the first couple of years. And the real sense of wanting to show an interest and wanting to take European voices seriously in contrast to the Trump administration before. That being said, though, I mean, yes, the Ukraine war obviously took up a lot of space and a lot of attention. I never felt like that was really seen as a European issue. I felt like that was seen as a Russia issue in DC. And for me, European issues are still really in the background here. And I found that striking every time I came to DC, how small the Europe community is here. You know, if you go beyond Russia, if you want to look at European Union experts or anything, you know, that doesn't directly affect Europe's spending on defense or military aid to Ukraine, I think there really are other issues that are much more important. And you can see that in funding structures of think tanks. You can see that in the events that are being held, with the exception maybe, and this is really surprising to me, maybe it shouldn't have been, but with the exception of Germany, there are so many Americans who really know about Germany and are very, very interested in German domestic politics. They know all about our very obscure debates about national security councils and coalition government negotiations. And it's really, I think, a legacy of the interest that the US has taken for so long in Europe, that the main focus is still often on Berlin rather than, for instance, on Brussels or elsewhere.
Maybe each of you could talk a little bit about some of the differences that you've seen from European think tanks and American think tanks. Maybe there aren't major differences, but be curious to see how you sort of view the European think tank landscape and the U.S. think tank landscape. And maybe there are things that Europe should do differently and maybe some things that U.S. think tanks should do differently. Sophia, maybe we'll go reverse order.
Sure. I have so many thoughts on this. I mean, I don't speak for all Europeans. I've worked in think tanks in the UK and in Germany. I think there's so many differences that have struck me since working here. One thing that was immediately clear to me is that the US think tank environment is so much more permissive, I think, in terms of what people are allowed to think and write about. It's much freer, I think, than in Europe, where often there's a sense of, you know, you do your PhD and then that is your expertise and that is what you will write about for the next 40 years of your career. Essentially the same article over and over and over again. On the other hand, though, there is much more policy entrepreneurship for ideas, I think, in the US. It's much more professional in terms of really trying to influence policy and then not being embarrassed to write the same idea up over and over and over again in lots of different formats and on lots of different podcasts and wherever you go to try and have an impact. I think that the titles and institutions are less important in DC than I have found them to be in Berlin, for instance. PhD is certainly less important. It's more important to write a book, I would say, than to have a PhD. Ideas are more important here. On the one hand, I find that, think tankers are much more integrated through the revolving door that Liana already mentioned in sort of government processes. On the other hand, though, you find the same divide between think tank intelligentsia and government. To me, a particularly striking example of that was the Ukraine membership in NATO debate, where really DC think tankers were having a conversation that seemed to be completely divided from what US government officials were talking about. Funding is another big one. I mean, the sums are much larger in DC think tanks and the fundraising operations are much more professional than they are in European think tanks. It also obviously comes with many challenges in terms of how to position your research to remain objective. I'm very lucky to work at the Carnegie Endowment, where there is an endowment, and so we can be quite picky about where we get funding from, and not every think tank is in that same lucky position. I mean, I could go on. I feel like I've already made enough enemies. But those were some of my first impressions over the last couple of years.
Tara, do you feel similarly? I mean, you sort of come from the European Council on Foreign Relations, which in some ways is probably one of the more American-style think tanks in Europe, where it's pan-European, and I think sort of come out of this notion of trying to create effectively a European version of where Liana's at the Council on Foreign Relations. So I'm curious for your take. Has it just been sort of a smooth transition over to Brookings?
Sure. So, I mean, the scale, I totally agree with what Sophia said. The scale of everything, the scale of the think tanks themselves, the scale of the funding, the amount of resources that come with this funding and this scale is just something that I have not seen elsewhere in Europe. And I come from ECFR, which is a fairly large think tank now. I think over 100 people across 7 offices. And we have people who are not based in offices based elsewhere in Europe. So ECFR has really grown a lot, but I was working in the Paris office before, and we were basically 10, 12 people. So at the scale of Paris, it was a fairly small think tank with the advantage of having the resources from, of course, other offices, other programs. So that was super helpful. But ECFR itself was a bit different than the rest of the Paris scale. And I think that's where the revolving door system also plays. What I feel here is that the system is more dynamic. You have people in Paris who've been in their think tanks for a fairly long time. And I don't think that's a bad thing in itself. But if we're actively thinking about policy options in a more constrained world, a more intense world, a more competitive world, it is helpful to understand the kind of constraints that policymakers find themselves in on a daily basis. And I do find that there's a big contrast there between what think tankers sometimes in Europe write and people on the other side who are in government who tend to be, if not antagonistic, at least a bit skeptical of what think tankers can bring to them. And I think that's a big conversation that we have in Europe, where people say, well, you're writing your papers and providing these policy recommendations with actually very little realization of what we have to go through on a daily basis. The interagency process, internal and intra-European discussions, and you're just writing your paper basically on your desk as a think tanker with very little realization of what we're going through. And in the end, what you're doing is not particularly helpful. So we have these difficult conversations, I find, in the European context that I guess some people have in the US context too, but it is different because at Brookings and at Carnegie and at other think tanks, we find ourselves in discussions with people who have been in government in the US, and they've been in government for either a short or a longer period of time with different administrations. And I do find that these are some conversations with these people on whatever side of the aisle they stand are part of the most interesting conversations that I've had in the past 18 months, because when they come out of government, I guess they have this realization of all the constraints, and they then write papers which reflect these constraints, are still, fairly ambitious and want to push these policy ideas. But I find that they're much more adequate and kind of tailor-made. And again, like I said, I think more dynamic and more to the point. And I do hope that we could have a reflection of that a little bit more in Europe. In my country, it's very difficult. I come from France. People who work in government have to be senior civil servants. Diplomats can come into think tanks. That can happen, but the reverse basically doesn't happen at all. And so there's also a discrepancy there, which I don't see changing anytime soon. I hope other countries would do it, but I think in France, it's still going to be a struggle for a very long time.
It seems sort of, I guess my impression is that American think tanks are a little bit more practical in their recommendations, or sort of more inside the box. Well, Europeans with PhDs, a little bit more academic and can think a little bit more outside the box at times. But Liana, curious for your thoughts and your impressions.
Yeah, I mean, there's really little to add to what Sophia and Tara brilliantly put together. But I want to underline something that Sophia said, and that is that there is, from my perspective, a genuine competition for ideas in US foreign policy and in the think tank landscape. For example, in foreign affairs, obviously the magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations is a big place where ideas are played out, but also foreign policy and others. And I also feel that officials are very receptive to these ideas, at least if they're not sort of part of the Trump administration, who are not receptive to any ideas of the foreign policy or to their own think tank community, which is sort of a different bubble that has emerged separately from the traditional think tank community. And one example is, for instance, the foreign policy for the middle class, which was like an entirely new idea. It was designed, it was brought into government. It even sort of got some feedback sort of from Europe, some people who were thinking about that. And I mean, the only similar example that I can come up with in Europe as a big idea that was introduced was by Macron, and that was sort of European strategic autonomy. And he's not a think tanker. I mean, many call him the think tanker in chief. And that is super fascinating. That sort of the only big idea in foreign policy really came from Macron, the think tanker in chief, and not from, I don't know, one of the big think tanks in Europe. And that is, I think, really a gap in European think tanking. And I think sometimes one of the reasons is perhaps also the attitude that European, also German officials, from my experience, have. They usually think they already know what think tankers can tell them, and they know it better and deeper because they are sort of on the file. Whereas the attitude here in the US, at least what I experienced, was more often, well, you don't need to know the details of, when this exactly happened, but we want you to look sort of at what is exactly sort of at the horizon, right? I mean, what is the thing we have to look out for that we don't have the time for now? And that is sort of a culture which is much more appreciative of think tanks, appreciating of think tank thought and ideas than I have experienced this in Germany and Europe.
That's a really interesting point, Liana, because I was just having dinner yesterday with someone who used to work at CSIS and is now in government. And his impression before going in was that he probably wouldn't have a lot of use for think tank reports because surely when you're inside government, you're going to be the expert, you know everything. And now that he's seeing it from the other side, he was telling me, actually, I can see the value because there's more distance. We can, some of these reports can look far out, but also for people coming into new positions inside the US government, we need to get smart on something pretty quickly. Those reports and that knowledge being built inside think tanks is really helpful. And I'm wondering if that's also because inside the US government, people move around so much more. They have to work on one issue on space, and then the next day they're on the South America desk. And so getting up to speed, I think, probably happens a little bit more. And that connects to a point, Sophia, you made, which I thought was a little bit funny just thinking about it, because when you said US think tanks are more permissive around what we can write about, talk about, I think that's both a positive sometimes, and also thinking about situations where in 2022, suddenly everybody was a Ukraine expert. Everyone was a Russia expert. So I think it has some value in that you can create really large conversations and get a lot of momentum around some issues, but you can also get situations where people weigh in on an issue that they haven't really studied that deeply. So I could see both sides.
Can I add something to this? Because I'm also really struck by the fact that, the US dominates the debate and US think tanks dominate the debate still. I think, of course, Foreign Affairs magazine is still considered one of the best. It's read by policymakers, by decision makers. But what I do find is that there is not that much reflection in DC of views from the rest of the world. And I can say it, first of all, for Europe. I mean, I was really struck. One of the things a bit less positive that struck me when I arrived here, and I think that's partly due both to the US and to Europeans, was how disorganized Europeans were in DC. Very little common voice. And people were telling me in the US, policymakers and think tankers, nothing has happened in Europe for the past 30 years. The Europeans are, just a bunch of lazy people not taking charge of themselves. And I was kind of thinking, well, in the past 4 years, actually, Europe has done a lot. And even the EU itself has done a lot, on health policy, on defense policy. It's clearly not enough. There's a lot of work to do still. Member states and the EU has to do a lot more. But the fact that there was quasi no reflection of European debates in the US impacting actually US policy was something that I found really striking. And I find that there is very little reflection of debates happening, in India, in Indonesia, in African countries. So, of course, Latin America is one huge blind spot that still strikes me today. So I think this is also something that's the part of the discussion that I'm missing and that I was not expecting to miss so much here.
We're really, spoiled for choice in Europe in the sense that we can go, when we talk about European politics, we can get experts from every country. Again, we have access to them really, really quickly. I felt the same way you felt, Tara, and that, there's often more trust placed, I think, by the American system in an American expert on a region than in an expert from the region, right? And that is natural in many ways. It's much more easily translatable, that kind of expertise, and the degrees make more sense in the US context. But that is really something that I've also tried in my work here to change and just bring European experts to talk about their own countries. Bring them over to DC, which is not actually something that I think happens very much.
Yeah, it strikes me as particularly a problem, especially when a region is sort of understudied. And it seems sort of bizarre to say that Europe is understudied, but certain parts of Europe are definitely understudied, the European Union, et cetera, that there just isn't a lot of focus at the think tank world. One thing that Donatien mentioned, which I think when you think about the U.S. government, you think about this large intelligence community that is sort of analyzing everything. And when you're in the U.S. government, you can read all of that. But the one thing the intelligence community doesn't do is provide policy recommendations. They sort of analyze a problem very thoroughly. They provide a lot of data, but then they're not telling policymakers what to do. And so I think that the role of the think tanks is sort of, you're kind of looking around the corner in a way that it's really hard for people that are in government to do. And so there's this kind of symbiotic relationship that tends to work. I wouldn't, sometimes, people in government will say they're reading your stuff, but they don't quite have time, but they have seen it come across their desk at one point. But the last point was really interesting, Tara. And I'm curious if there's other things that, I guess if you were to go and tell European governments or your European colleagues, what are they getting wrong about Washington? What are the kind of classic misconceptions that Europeans may have in how they think about how things are done here?
I'll just go very briefly. I think when we arrived here, I kind of assumed, and I think particularly coming from a pan-European think tank, that it would be easy to do things in a European manner here. And it's not, because, most countries' embassies, of course, but also researchers, they go the bilateral way. You want to have a relationship with the US administration, policymakers directly. You don't necessarily want to share these contacts, which is something that I guess I found a bit striking. I'm a little naive that way. But I've also found that with Sophia, with Liana, with others, we've actually worked together on events, on papers, and we've done this fairly naturally because we felt like we needed to do it. I think the EU delegation could do a lot more to bring us together. I think, some member states can do it, the French and the Germans and the Poles, but others, I think, the Baltics do interesting things. But I think you kind of need to be prepared while coming in DC as a European that people here don't follow European debates as much as you expect them to. And so that's interesting. For me to bring this European flavor, these European perspectives, I should say, is something that we really need to do differently. I think, in a bit more of a systematic manner. I am quite struck that people here know Germany a lot more than they know other European countries. And I think that's partly due to the fact that actually, Germany has a massive soft power here through the foundations. There's a lot of private money. People, in the US have done fellowships in Germany. They've lived in Germany. So even when they disagree with German politics, they have some empathy in that they know how it works. And I have not felt this for France, for instance. I'm not even talking about another country. I've been struck by how little people know how the French system works here, something that I was not expecting, and some things that appeared that I thought were, totally obvious that I didn't really need to write about. I realized that I needed to, why there were pension reform demonstrations last year. What's currently happening in French politics, that's also not so understandable, I guess, for the French people and for myself. Going through this process, having to learn how to re-explain your own country, I think is an interesting process and something that we need to do a bit more systematically. And I don't think that's mutually exclusive to actually also working together on European ideas to be defended in DC. I think we need to do both.
Liana, did you want to?
I'm trying to think about something where we don't repeat ourselves, but it really is the idea of Europeans that Washington cares as much about Europe as Europe cares about the United States. And this is just not the case. I mean, how insulted Europeans were about the IRA, right? And the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, there was this one provision that countries, units with a free trade agreement, that the United States has, with benefit from that. And the fact that Europe was overlooked there, that it was just such a big issue and Europeans thought it's all about them, that was a very intentional act of the United States. And where they overlook how much of US foreign policy and sort of in general policy making, the IRA is not only foreign policy, it's really about domestic politics in the United States. And then extends to foreign policy, which has different priorities than Europe. And this sort of circling around the United States and circling about what do they say to us? What do they think of us? How can we please them? How can we, how can we annoy the United States if we want? It's understandable given the power structures and the influence the United States has, but it's entirely striking to me still until this day.
It reminds me a little bit of there's a Mad Men meme. John Draper sort of junior staffer says, I feel bad for you. And Don Draper looks at him and says, I don't think about you at all.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, I think it's such an important point that Liana made. I mean, one thing that I find is almost the least constructive thing Europeans can do when they come to the US is complain about how little Americans know about Europe. I mean, and what? That's your job. I mean, you can't expect Americans to do a master's degree in EU politics and understand the processes. You need to have your messaging fixed, and you need to have one message. Be aware of the fact that you have very little time, very little face time with US officials, and they don't want to hear about intra-European disagreements. They want you all to deliver the same message and have a very clear agenda and have deliverables that you can offer and things that you want from them, you know. And we're still, I think, a little bit nostalgic for what the relationship maybe used to be. I mean, I joke that Germans think about it in a very paternal way and the French think about it in a very amorous way. I mean, the Germans think of the US as sort of this lenient parent nudging them out of the basement, and the French think about them as a lover who is interested in other areas of the world now. But either way, I think you're overstating how much the US thinks about you at all. The other thing that I would say is that Europeans are, I think, quite stuck in, and that is changing a little bit now, but for years we've been quite stuck in who we talk to in DC, talking to the experts in transatlantic relations, both in the think tank field and in the government. And when you do that, you'll end up talking about the quote unquote transatlantic relationship, and you'll necessarily talk to people who care in the first place. When really, I think the relationship is no longer what matters. You really have to talk to subject matter experts. You have to talk to the trade people. You have to talk to the climate people. You might have to talk to the defense people to really get a sense of where US thinking is. And I think that is changing a little bit now, ironically, with the specter of a Trump presidency, because Europeans are trying to broaden the circles of who they speak with, trying to get more into Republican circles, even though there too, I'm not sure how useful that will be in predicting Trump's behavior, but at least the circles are getting a bit broader.
No, I just wanted to pick up with the two fingers on where Sophia ended, because I think that's another difference between the United States and the European think tank community, that between the United States and the European think tank community, that we do see some kind of innovation here in the United States. And we are all from very traditional, old think tanks here, right? But what is fascinating to me, this trend since the Trump presidency, is this mushrooming of kind of MAGA, right-wing Republican think tanks, or what, you know, the way how they try to emulate think tanks, or the morphing of traditionally Republican think tanks like Heritage into more MAGA think tanks. And so that also shows, I mean, it's innovative in that way because it shows that the US think tanks are catering to the needs of the political establishment. And if there is a need to have a MAGA think tank, then someone will establish a MAGA think tank and try to copy the way it works in the same way as sort of the traditional think tanks, and to say, well, now we have our own ecosystem here, and this is how we do things. And it sometimes reminds me of the discussion about how China tries to copy international institutions, but sort of with their own flavor. And that's sort of what is happening to some extent with the MAGA Republican think tanks here in DC. But it is still an interesting development because it shows that there's some dynamic here that is perhaps more difficult to accept for the traditional think tanks. But it's also something where, as Sophia said, Europeans are sort of only slowly opening up, that, you know, only going to Brookings and Carnegie and to the council may not necessarily help them under certain political conditions. And I haven't said that on a public file. Everyone, please come to CSIS and CFR and Brookings and Carnegie. But they will hear opinions at these MAGA Republican think tanks that they will not hear at our think tanks.
Which is definitely important, I think, for them to hear that. And we see that from delegations who come here now, European delegations, and they do the rounds. They go to Hudson, they go to Heritage, then they come to CSIS, Brookings, etc. I think we're also kind of seeing the early days of similar dynamics in Europe when you see Hungary funding similar research institutions, like think tank type places that are more on the conservative side to basically work on that kind of worldview. But I also wanted to say on Sophia's point around expanding where Europeans, who Europeans are talking to, it's also not just talking to different kinds of people in the executive branch. It's also going to Congress. understanding the difference and where, you can say we want them to be invested in Europe, but also appropriations is super important. Understanding where the money is coming from for what the executive branch is then going to allocate. This money is coming from Congress. So being able to work with that too on the trade side, understanding how the states work and where that kind of leverage exists there too. And the last point that came to mind also, Sophia, when you were talking about your last point is I've found it personally. So listeners know I'm from Belgium. I moved to the US in 2013. Working on Europe here, I think has been super valuable for my analysis of the transatlantic relationship, because I came here being super pro-EU, gung-ho on the political project and all of this. And I still am to a wide extent. But seeing how, for example, the European delegation here does its work and how it tries to do outreach, I found myself getting really frustrated at times to say, well, on two fronts. One, on the European front, be like, please clarify your message. You can do this better. But on the flip side, also getting really frustrated with US voices who were saying, well, the EU is too complicated. I don't want to learn. And Sophia, I think you mentioned this, like, well, okay, that's your job. We have to be okay with the fact that a lot of people here don't understand it and don't really want to put in the work to grasp the complexity of it. But that's also why think tanks are here, to try to grasp that complexity, and hopefully Europeans understanding that when they come here, they have to be prepared to be super simple about the terms that they use and the kind of messaging that they bring.
Can I add something here? Because it goes to a point that Sophia and I have discussed quite a lot also about the sense of exclusivity that comes from the Europeans when we talk about the transatlantic relationship. For a lot of the Europeans, this transatlantic relationship is something that's, so precious, almost sacred, that it cuts both ways, it goes both ways. And so this is why when the IRA happens, we completely see it from our perspective as a betrayal of sorts. But arriving here, what really struck me is that, yes, the transatlantic relationship is super important, but it's just one amongst many other key strategic relationships that the US has in the world. And that was interesting too, because we tend to, of course, from our perspective in Europe, to see it through this lens almost solely. And it's really not the case here. And I think just that in itself is an interesting realization, because then I hope that it means that we adapt our ways of thinking, the voices that we bring here. And the fact that there's no exclusivity from the US side also means that there's a bit of confusion, I would say, from the US side too, talking about how the EU could be more of a defense actor. You hear some voices in the executive branch who think it might be helpful, it could be possible, though there's still a little of reluctance there. And then you get other people in the administration who tell you the EU should never be a defense actor. And so you hear all these voices. I'm not even talking about Congress here, but there's still a bit of reluctance, I would say, between the general messaging and the actual implementation of what Europeans could do with the Americans when it comes to security and defense, something that's not totally accepted in reality. And again, something that it took me a bit of time to understand and realize here, which is interesting in itself.
I love that we have the French person arguing for polyamory in the transatlantic relationship. I just put something on that last point about the clarity of the message. I think it's also just a structural issue in a relationship where the power dynamic is so skewed, is that when Americans talk to Europeans are not going to criticize what the Americans are doing. And then in those conversations, also the Americans will often reassure Europeans that they're going to be there forever, which both of these things I think are helpful. We haven't quite moved on to the necessary honesty that I think we need in order to reframe the relationship to a more pragmatic and realistic new balance.
I think that's probably a great message to end on, mixing the optimistic and realistic nature of the conversation that we've had, but both realizing that things probably need to change and that there's still a lot of very productive conversations happening in the relationship and, of course, within all the amazing think tanks presented in this panel here.
Sophia, Tara, and Liana, Washington is very lucky to have all three of you here in town and to enrich our understanding of Europe, Russia, and the transatlantic relationship.
So please invite us again.
Yes, no, but I also think it's sort of an interesting, one thing about the transatlantic think tank space is that there's a lot to learn from how I think each of us do our business, both here in Washington, how various think tanks work. We're on the one hand, arch rivals and fierce competitors because we're, always trying to get one over here at CSIS over Brookings and CFR and Carnegie. But on the other hand, it's a very kind of collegial space. And so it's great to have colleagues like you all here in Washington. And I just want to thank you so much for being here on the Europhile and for our special summer episode.
Thanks for being part of that Europe group with you and your colleagues at CSIS.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Europhile. Make sure to subscribe and leave us a rating wherever you get your podcasts. For more expert analysis on other foreign policy topics, visit csis.org/podcasts.